The morning of the memorial began with a heavy sky over St. Petersburg, Florida, the kind of gray that made the palms look tired and the Gulf sound like it was breathing through its teeth. And Oscar, 80 years old and straight-backed despite the cane he used after his hip surgery, rose before dawn, shaved slow, pressed his navy suit with the iron he kept in the hall closet, and laid his son Daniel's fishing cap on the kitchen table, as if to remind himself why he needed to keep his hands steady. He drove his old Buick to the chapel in a thin drizzle, parked near the back under a leaning oak, and walked in carrying a small bouquet of marigolds, because Clara, his late wife, used to say marigolds chase away bad spirits. Inside the chapel, the air smelled like lilies and damp wood, and the candles flickered along the aisle as neighbors shuffled to their seats, whispering things that always sound the same at funerals, but still mean something when the loss is yours. At the front sat a framed photo of Daniel on a pier, sun in his eyes. A red snapper lifted high in both hands, and seeing it hit Oscar like a slow punch, but he kept breathing, counting to 4 in and 6 out the way the doctor taught him, and took a seat in the front row, where he could set the marigolds beneath the picture and rest both palms over the knob of his cane. Vanessa, the widow, arrived a few minutes later with her mother Patricia and her brother Brandon, all black fabric and stiff shoulders, the pearls at her ears bright as rain on stone, and she took the aisle like she owned the floor, pausing just long enough to squeeze Oscar's shoulder without looking at his face before stepping past him to the reserved family row, where she sat in the center chair and fixed her eyes on the pastor. The service moved in a straight line. Hymn, prayer, a simple reading about seas and storms. And when the pastor invited family to share words, Vanessa stood and walked to the podium with a crisp, practiced step, glanced at her phone as if confirming an appointment, and cleared her throat. Her voice was smooth at the start, a few sentences about Daniel's smile, Daniel's work ethic, Daniel's love of the water. But then it sharpened, and she said, "For clarity, the company inheritance goes to the wife only, not outsiders." And Patricia nodded with approval, while Brandon folded his arms like a bouncer, and a hush slid across the pews, a thin, weird hush that didn't belong to grief. Oscar did not flinch, did not let his face show the heat in his chest, because he had learned on job sites and in emergency rooms that the person who keeps quiet first is the person who moves first after. So he sat and watched the way Vanessa tilted her chin after the statement. Watched the way Patricia's fingers tapped the program twice. Watched the way Brandon looked down at his shoes as if checking for scuffs. He thought of the night the sheriff called the drowning an accident. Thought of the bent rail on the stern, the small scrape on the gel coat that looked more like a shove than a slip. The bilge camera that somehow went offline the one day Daniel took the boat out alone. The smartwatch that must have sunk, though Daniel wore it like a second wrist. And he remembered Vanessa's dry eyes when she said, he loved the water. And the way she added, like a tag, everything will be handled according to company policy. When the pastor closed with prayer, Oscar stood, felt the ache in his hip flare and settle, and walked the aisle to touch the frame of Daniel's photo with 2 fingers, an old habit from the carpentry shop when he used to tap a finished joint for luck. And then he turned to face the line of people offering condolences. Their words warmed and cooled him in small waves. He was a good man. He helped my nephew get a job. I'm so sorry, Mr. Collins. And he gave each person a full nod, counted the beats between breaths, and kept his eyes on small details, because small details had kept him alive and solvent for 80 years. The smear of foundation on Vanessa's collar like she dressed in a hurry. The way Patricia folded the program into squares and hid it in her clutch. The faint smell of salt and engine grease on Brandon's cuffs, as if he had been near the marina this morning. Though he claimed to have spent the night at the funeral home. Outside, the drizzle had thinned to a mist, and Oscar stood under the chapel eave while the family clustered by the cars. Vanessa whispering fast into her phone. Patricia staring at him with a look that tried to mix pity and ownership. Brandon lighting a cigarette and then crushing it out when the chapel attendant frowned. Oscar drove home slowly along the bay, wipers ticking, the water on his left the same polished gray as the sky, And when he reached his bungalow, he hung his jacket on the same hook Clara used to use for her sun hat, set Daniel's cap back on the table, and made a pot of coffee, even though his doctor told him to cut back. He took out the leather notebook where he kept simple lists, wrote today's date, and made 2 columns, what I saw and what I will do. And under the first, he wrote public claim about inheritance, no tears from her. Brandon smells like Doc. And under the second, he wrote call Douglas, pull financial lever, ask questions about camera and watch. He let the coffee sit until it cooled to something he could sip, and he went to the living room and lowered himself into Clara's chair, the one with the small dip where her shoulder used to rest. And he looked at the framed photos on the shelf. Wedding day. Daniel at 8 with a gap-toothed grin, the first rental warehouse he and Clara bought with a bank that barely believed in them. And he said out loud in the quiet room, "We will do this right, kid. We will do this slow. We will do this clean." The clock on the wall marked the minutes like a metronome. And when the hour hand reached 8 the next morning, a light broke across the water, and Oscar took his phone from the counter, scrolled to the number labeled Douglas, his financial advisor, the man who had helped him build Seabreeze Holdings with patience and plain speech. And he pressed call. Douglas picked up on the second ring with a gentle, "Good morning, Oscar." And Oscar said in a voice that did not shake, "Withdraw my $75 million investment from Smith Enterprises." And there was a small pause, a breath, and then Douglas said, "Are you certain?" And Oscar said, "I am." And Douglas said, "I'll file the notice through Seabreeze and the sub-holdings now and send you the board schedule when it pings." And Oscar said, "Thank you," and set the phone down with care. 10 minutes later, as the legal notices cleared their first gate and the electronic bells began to ring inside Smith Enterprises, in a high condominium with a view of the same gray water, Vanessa looked at her screen, saw the first alert from the company counsel, then another from the CFO, then 3 more with subject lines that all began with the word urgent. And her phone started buzzing. Oscar spent the next hours moving like a man who knew every nail in his own house, steady and patient, because he understood that speed without order only breaks things. He washed his cup, put the marigolds in a short glass by Daniel's photo, and laid out a clean pad of paper on the kitchen table to build a timeline from the last 2 weeks, writing down dates, times, and names in block letters so nothing blurred in his head. At 9:12 a.m., Douglas called back to confirm the withdrawal notices had been filed through Seabreeze Holdings and its smaller shells, and that the electronic receipts had hit the company's counsel inbox and the lender's alert system, which meant the first consequence inside Smith Enterprises would not be loud voices, but a quiet lock on lines of credit. Oscar asked for printed copies of the original subscription agreements, the control clause, the acceleration terms, and the voting rights. Because paper speaks plainly when people start spinning, Douglas said he would drive over with a folder by noon, and he added in the same even tone that the board had already scheduled an emergency meeting for the next morning, and that Vanessa's mother, Patricia, had emailed the receptionist to restrict access to executives and blood family. Which made Oscar shake his head once and say, "Bring the original signatures, not just scans." And Douglas said, "Of course." After the call, Oscar went to the small room that had been Clara's sewing room and now held a gun safe he used as a document cabinet, and he unlocked it, removed a blue 3-ring binder marked Seabreeze, Structure, and flipped through the chain charts they had built 5 years earlier when Daniel married into the Smith family and believed he could help the factory, not with words but with machines and training. Back then, Oscar had not wanted to be known, only to give his son a fair field, so he and Douglas created a clean path for the money. Seabreeze at the top, then 2 Florida LLCs, then a Delaware holding company that took the shares, and tight conditions that said money could be pulled if the company tried to hide losses or harm the assets. He remembered the night he signed those pages, Clara already gone, the kitchen quiet like today, and he remembered saying out loud, "Use it right, kid," as if Daniel could hear across town. Now he put each key page into a fresh plastic sleeve and set them in order on the table so he could grab them in seconds tomorrow. At 10:05 a.m., he called the marina and asked for the manager, a man named Pete, who knew Oscar by voice because Oscar tipped the dock crew at Christmas. Oscar said he wanted to check Daniel's slip and any maintenance notes tied to the boat's bilge camera. And Pete said he would be there until 3, and that the camera had been down for service on the day of the accident. A phrase that made Oscar write the words exactly as said, down for service, with quotes, and circle them. He put on his windbreaker even though the rain had stopped, pocketed a small flashlight, and drove to the marina on the Bay Road where pelicans sat like old judges on the railings. Pete met him at the office window, cap low, hands rough and honest, and walked him to Daniel's slip, now rented to no one out of respect. The boat had been impounded and released weeks earlier, then sold by the estate to cover unrelated bills after Vanessa's quick filings, which Oscar noted without remark because it told him how fast she moved when papers could make money. The dock boards were dry, but still showed a lighter rectangle where the small pole camera had been mounted on the stern rail, and Oscar crouched slow, hip careful, and looked at the screw holes. 2 had new clean edges, 2 had burrs, and the spacing was not even, a sign of a rushed reinstall after a removal. He asked Pete for the work order that took the camera offline and the name of the contractor. Pete looked nervous and said a third-party tech handled marina electronics, and that the ticket showed temporary cover for maintenance. No detail on who asked, which was odd because Pete said he usually approved those, and Oscar thanked him and did not push, just asked for a copy and a list of the dock staff on duty the day before and the day of the accident. He walked the line of slips in a slow loop, letting his eyes rest on small things, and near the corner post he saw a torn piece of clear tape stuck under the lip of the rail, the kind used to cover ports, sticky, gone dirty with salt. He eased it off with 2 fingers and folded it in a napkin from his pocket. Back at the office, he asked about outside cameras in the area and learned that the bait shop across the canal kept one over its door, so he drove there and bought a coffee and a pack of hooks he did not need. Then asked the owner, a woman named Luann, if her camera ever caught the docks at night, and she said it caught whatever walked past, people and gulls and drunks, and that she kept the last 30 days on a little black box. Oscar asked if she could save the 2 evenings around the accident, and she said yes, because Daniel had once helped her nephew get a maintenance job, and she wrote her number on the receipt and promised to call when the copy was ready. When Oscar returned home, Douglas was waiting at the table with the promised folder and a calm face. And behind him sat a woman in a navy blazer with a spiral notebook and short gray hair. Douglas introduced her as Rosa Delgado, a retired Miami-Dade detective who now worked private cases with a careful hand. Oscar offered coffee, which she declined with a smile. And then he told the story from the start, not skipping anything. The sheriff's call, the bent rail, the missing smartwatch, the bilge camera offline, Vanessa's dry eyes, the memorial speech about outsiders, and the buzz of phones after the withdrawal. Rosa listened without interrupting, wrote names and times, and then asked simple questions that pulled more detail. What boots Daniel wore on the boat? Whether he could swim? He could. Well, who had keys to the slipgate? Family kept a card, Marina kept logs. Whether Daniel had changed insurance in the last year? Oscar did not know. And who would gain control at the company if Daniel pushed for stricter audits? Vanessa and Patricia would lose influence if he sided with the CFO. Oscar said because the banks had asked for independent oversight. Rosa laid out a plan in plain language. She would pull public records, request marina logs, look for any maintenance ticket signed by a contractor on the camera, check nearby cameras for a white SUV Vanessa drove, and ask a friend at the sheriff's office to review the initial report for gaps. She would also look for life insurance changes, because sudden increases tell stories when grief claims accidents. Oscar slid the napkin with the clear tape across the table, and Rosa bagged it in a small zipper pouch, then asked if Oscar had Daniel's spare tackle bag or watch charger. Oscar had both in the hall closet because the sheriff gave him Daniel's property box 2 weeks ago. Rosa took photos of the items and asked to borrow the charger to check if the smartwatch account had any cloud backups he could access as next of kin. Douglas went through the board plan. They would attend at 9 a.m., present originals, and state the intent to redeem under the control clause. They would not argue about grief or history. They would keep to the document and the clock. If blocked, they would call the company attorney by name and read section numbers aloud. Oscar agreed. The day slid toward evening, and Rosa left with a firm handshake and a promise to text by night if anything urgent broke. After she left, Oscar and Douglas sat for a minute in quiet like men who had packed a truck and checked the straps twice. And then Douglas stood and said, "They will try to make this about family. We will make it about facts." And Oscar nodded and walked him to the door. As the sun lowered, Oscar dialed the sheriff's office and left a message for the detective of record, polite and brief, telling him a retired detective would bring new material and that he wanted nothing more than a clean look at a bad night. He ate soup, returned to the table, and read the control clause one more time, running his finger down the lines like a carpenter checking level. At 8:37 p.m., his phone buzzed with Rosa's text. Insurance on Daniel increased 6 months ago. Beneficiary Vanessa. Also, a work order closed on BilgeCam day before accident by contractor who now lists address as Weekly Motel in Kissimmee. I will visit tomorrow early. Sleep. Oscar set the phone beside Daniel's cap, turned off the kitchen light, and said into the dim room, "We're moving, kid, one board at a time." Then he went to bed and slept with the window cracked to the Gulf, so the steady push and pull of the water could measure the night until morning. Rosa left St. Petersburg before sunrise with a thermos of black coffee, Daniel's phone in her bag, and the little zipper pouch holding the clear tape Oscar had found under the stern rail, because she believed in starting where the trail first bent. The motel in Kissimmee sat behind a faded Waffle House sign, all peeling paint and thin doors, and the contractor's name on the registry, Mark Ellison, matched the service ticket Oscar had circled the night before. She knocked twice, showed her retired badge on a lanyard she kept for moments like this, and spoke in a patient voice that made nervous men feel the floor under their feet. "I am not here to hurt you. I'm here to let you tell the truth before someone else writes it wrong." And Mark, bearded, sunburned, smelling of flux and old coffee, opened the door and sagged against the frame like a rope that carried too much weight. He said he only covered a camera and took cash because a woman in pearls said the marina wanted temporary maintenance for a VIP family. He said he used clear adhesive squares cut from a roll and blue tape edges to hold a plastic patch on the bilge camera housing. He said he unplugged a small power lead behind the stern rail and left the screws loose to make the job look ongoing. And he said he was told no invoice and no names, which he knew was wrong but needed rent. Rosa asked for details he could not fake: where he parked, behind the bait shop, what car the woman drove, white SUV with a dent by the rear plate, what time, just before sunset, who opened the gate, a young dockhand with a clip-on badge and Vanessa's brother standing 5 steps back, and whether anyone touched the stern rail after him. The woman in pearls pressed her thumb hard near the top screw. "Checking," she said, which would matter later if the lab found oil from a lotion or a print. Rosa recorded his statement on her phone, then wrote it out longhand and had him sign with today's date beside a simple line that said, "I did this on the day before the accident." She snapped photos of the roll of adhesive in his toolbox and the half-pack of clear squares and took one with his permission for comparison. Then called her friend at the sheriff's office, Detective Harper, and said in a steady tone, "I have a cooperating witness admitting camera interference tied to a death ruled accidental. I also have motive evidence developing." And Harper told her to bring everything to the substation by afternoon so they could draft a clean warrant tree. Rosa drove back west with the sun climbing and called Luann at the bait shop to ask about the camera copy. Luann said it finished an hour ago, so Rosa stopped there first, bought a soda she did not want to pay for the kindness, and carried out a small USB drive wrapped in a sticky note that read, 2 nights, 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., both days. In the car, she opened her laptop and watched simple squares of recorded life. Gulls, a couple arguing, a man slipping a beer under his jacket, and then, on the evening before the accident, a white SUV easing into the far corner, lights off, a woman in a white sweater stepping out and pacing near the dock, her phone glowing in her hand. 15 minutes later, A man in a gray shirt and work shorts, Mark, walked past carrying a small kit. The woman held the gate with her shoulder while he slipped through, and another figure, taller, male, lingered behind a piling with a face half hidden by a cap. Rosa scrubbed the timeline forward and saw them exit 22 minutes later. The man wiping his hands on a shop rag, the woman glancing up at the bait shop camera, and then away, and she took still frames with timestamps and saved them to a folder labeled Smith Evidence. She drove straight to Oscar's because he needed to see the path from rumor to proof, and found him at the kitchen table with Douglas reviewing the order of exhibits for the morning board meeting. Originals on one stack, certified copies on another, sticky flags marking the control clause and acceleration terms. She set the laptop down, played the bait shop clip twice, and said in simple words, "This is the night before your son died. This is the woman who told a room you were an outsider." And Oscar did not curse or raise his voice. He only touched the screen near the white sweater and nodded once, as if measuring an exact cut on a plank. Douglas asked whether the timestamp matched the marina logs, and Rosa answered that she needed those logs from the gate system, which likely recorded card taps by number. And she already had a subpoena draft in Harper's inbox if the marina did not hand them over as a courtesy. She then turned to Daniel's phone, connected it to her laptop with the charger cable, and opened the health data that synced from his missing smartwatch earlier on the day he died. The last watch sync showed at 4:02 p.m. with a normal heart rate and step count while he walked from the parking lot to the dock. Then nothing after 4:17 p.m., which in itself meant little except that the watch lost connection or power. But Daniel's phone log, sitting dry in the boat's cabin when deputies found it, told a harder story. A missed call from Vanessa at 5:11 p.m., a voicemail from an unknown number at 5:16 p.m. that had been deleted but left a recoverable header, and a text from Daniel at 5:22 p.m. to the marina manager that read, "Heading out. Camera still down?" with no reply. Rosa photographed each screen and exported the logs. She then dialed Pete at the marina on speaker and asked if he would check whether a card belonging to V. Smith or B. Smith pinged the gate the day before the accident. And after a pause, he said he could not provide that by phone. But if law enforcement asked, he would comply, to which Rosa calmly replied, "Watch your email for an official request," and hung up. Her phone buzzed. Harper again, saying the state attorney on duty would bless a narrow warrant for the gate logs, the bait shop footage as authenticated by the owner, the contractor's phone records for the hour of the job, and any insurance changes filed by Vanessa in the last 12 months. Rosa told Harper about the white SUV, and Harper said patrol could pull neighborhood cameras on the road to the marina to look for the plate, which would help place Vanessa at the scene. The day kept moving in straight lines. Rosa drove to the substation and handed over the signed statement, the adhesive sample, the USB with video, and copies of the health and phone logs. Harper, careful and methodical, logged each item and nodded at the clean chain. Then Rosa returned to Oscar's for a short, clear briefing before the next day's board meeting, telling him, "Tomorrow, you sit at the head of the table and talk only about rights and numbers. Let the sheriff handle crimes." And Oscar agreed, because he knew the difference between a ledger and a charge sheet. In the late afternoon, Luann called again to say she had found an older clip on her camera from 2 weeks before, where Daniel stood in front of the bait shop window with a clipboard, talking on his phone about audits and training, and about not letting family push numbers, which Rosa saved as context for motive. Douglas's phone chimed with emails from lenders to Smith Enterprises, each tightening terms and asking for clarification of majority control. And he turned the screen so Oscar could see the quiet power of a signed clause at work. As dusk settled, Rosa drove one last loop by the marina to stand where Daniel had stepped from dock to deck. And she looked at the stern rail where new screws shone against old metal and imagined the quick hand that loosened them and the firm hand that pushed. And she promised the water out loud that she would not let it keep the last word this time. Back at Oscar's, he placed Daniel's cap beside the folder for the morning, lined up his cane with the chair leg like a soldier lining his rifle on a rack, and thanked Rosa and Douglas in a voice that stayed even because even voices carry far. When they left, he walked to the window and watched the thin lights on the bay blinking like patient signals, and he whispered to Clara's empty chair, "It is coming together, love. One nail, one board, one honest piece of proof at a time." Then he turned off the lamp, set an alarm for an early start, and let the sound of the Gulf weigh the night down until it was still. The next morning came clear and hot over Tampa, and Oscar, dressed in his navy blazer, with the same slow care he used to hang a door, checked the folder of originals twice, slipped Daniel's cap into the inside pocket like a quiet hand on his shoulder, and rode with Douglas across the bridge while the river shone under the sun. They parked in Visitor and walked into Smith Enterprises' glass lobby, where the receptionist looked up, recognized Oscar, and began the scripted line about executives and family only. But Douglas laid a letter on the counter that said Seabreeze Holdings, majority shareholder, voting control 51%, and added in a calm voice, "We're here for the board meeting under the notice rules." So the receptionist's smile froze, the phone went to her ear, and a moment later, the conference door clicked open to reveal Vanessa with her pearls, Patricia with a stiff mouth, Brandon with a phone in his palm, and Robert, the chair, with a face like a man who suddenly found he had been living in the wrong house. "This is a private session," Robert started, but Douglas stepped past him, pulled a chair from the head of the table, and slid it back for Oscar as if the room had been built for this. The table was long and glossy, a line of legal pads at each place, water glasses sweating in the air conditioning. The city's river view framed by clean glass, as if the company had borrowed transparency from a window rather than its books. Oscar set his cane to the right, his folder to the left, and said in a level voice, "Let's keep our time simple. Documents and decisions." And he opened to the original subscription agreement, the control clause, the acceleration terms, and the notice of redemption. Douglas filed yesterday, each page marked with a colored flag and an original signature that even a distant cousin could recognize. The company attorney, a gray-haired man named Sherman, slid his glasses down, read the top page, then the next, then the clause that allowed Seabreeze to redeem on breach of funding conditions or at will with notice after the 5-year mark, and his shoulders sank an inch as if gravity had remembered his name. Vanessa laughed once, a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it, and said, "An old man with a pension does not own my company." And Oscar, who had been insulted by tougher men on noisier job sites, did not blink, only tapped the page with one finger and said, "Numbers don't care who you are." Then looked to Sherman. The attorney cleared his throat and spoke to the room instead of to Oscar. "The agreements are valid. Seabreeze has majority voting rights and lawful grounds for redemption. If liquidity is short, the clause allows accelerated asset sale, and the word sale moved through the room like a cold draft. Patricia leaned forward and tried to pull the meeting back to custom and nameplates, said, "We are family. There must be a way to resolve this without destruction." But Douglas kept the line clear. "We are not here to discuss feelings. We are here to state rights and timelines." Notice was served. Redemption begins. Lenders will be informed today. As if on cue, Brandon's phone buzzed. Then again, then a third time, and he turned it face down, but the screen lit on the table like a lighthouse warning rock below the surface. The CFO, a quiet man in shirt sleeves who had said nothing yet, finally asked the question that mattered to the workers, and not just the names on the door. "What happens to the plant if funding pulls?" And Oscar turned to him with the respect he gave men who kept the books clean and said, "If I can help it, the plant runs. Just not under people who call partners outsiders at a funeral." And Vanessa flinched, small but real, and looked at her mother before looking back at Oscar with a practiced calm. Robert tried a different angle. "What do you want to make this go away?" And Oscar shook his head, slow, patient. "Nothing. It's not a negotiation. It's a correction." Then nudged another document across the table, a short letter that authorized Douglas to begin discussions with qualified buyers who would keep operations and honor worker retention. And though he did not say a name, the message was plain. There were grown adults outside this room who could run a factory without a family tree. Patricia pressed her palms flat, as if the table were a stage she could still command, and said, "You're doing this because you hate us." And Oscar answered without heat, I'm doing this because Daniel deserved truth in life, and he will have it in death. I put money here to help him build something honest. You made it clear yesterday that honesty had no seat. And he let the silence sit, the way you let a level settle before you mark the cut. Douglas then read the calendar like a foreman reading a punch list. 10 a.m. today, lender notices. 2 p.m., supplier advisories. 48 hours from now, formal tender for redemption schedule. If liquidity is insufficient, we move to asset sale under Section 12. Your counsel can confirm the wording. Here are the tabs. And Sherman nodded, eyes on the clause. Vanessa tried one more pivot, voice softening. Oscar, you're grieving. Daniel would not want the company to suffer. And Oscar kept his gaze on the papers and said, Daniel would not want lies to win. We'll keep the workers working if we can. The rest is not my burden anymore. And when he looked up, his eyes were glass clear. Then he made a choice that was not about law but about message, and spoke one more sentence in the same plain tone. By the way, your bilge camera was covered the day before Daniel went out, and the gate saw a white SUV the same night. And he did not say how he knew. He did not say who told him. He did not accuse. He just placed the fact on the table like a square piece of wood that either fit or did not. And for a heartbeat, Vanessa's face lost its paint. And Patricia's fingers tightened on the water glass, and Brandon looked down as if the carpet had words. Sherman shifted, sensing the air change, and the CFO closed his eyes like a man who had seen a ledger cross a line no accountant can fix. Oscar stood, his body old but his hand steady, and said, You have my notice. You have my terms. The sheriff will have whatever else belongs to him. And he took his folder, placed Daniel's cap back against his chest under the blazer, and turned toward the door while Douglas left behind a neat stack of certified copies with a cover sheet that read, For your records. In the hall, Rosa stood with her notebook, not inside because she was not a showpiece, but close enough to watch. You see it? Oscar asked softly, and Rosa nodded once. Flinch at camera, flinch at SUV, brother checks the phone when you say gate. And she added, Harper's warrants are inked. We pull the logs at noon, which made Oscar breathe out through his nose like a man setting down a heavy beam without dropping it. Back in the room, voices rose. Robert blaming counsel, Patricia blaming banks, Vanessa calling a crisis lawyer. While outside, Douglas put a short list in Oscar's hand. Lender calls he would take, supplier calls he would not, and a time to meet James Morrison of West Park Industries after lunch to talk about keeping the line running if a sale came fast. They reached the elevator, and Oscar pressed the button and looked out over the river for a long second, then said to Rosa in the simple words that always made her trust him, We'll stay clean. You stay close. And when the doors opened, they rode down without speaking. 3 people in a box, carrying a set of plain tools, paper, time, and truth, toward the next cut that had to be measured and made. By noon, the day of the board meeting, the case began to move like a tide with a steady pull. Not fast, but sure, and Rosa kept it in order so nothing slipped. She met Detective Harper at the Marina office with a short stack of fresh warrants and a chain of custody form clipped to a clipboard, and Pete handed over the gate access logs with 2 hands like a man passing a fragile tool, every entry stamped with date, time, and card number. Rosa and Harper spread the printouts on the counter next to a laminated map of slips and traced the line for the evening before Daniel died. 6:41 p.m., card ending in 27, registered to Vanessa Smith, opened the pedestrian gate. 6:42 p.m., card ending in 31, registered to Brandon Smith, opened the same gate. 7:06 p.m., card 27 exited. 7:07 p.m., card 31 exited. Rosa circled each with a red pen and wrote pre-accident camera cover beside the line, then flipped to the day of the death. There, 4:02 p.m., Daniel's employee card entered. 5:13 p.m., card 31. Brandon entered again. 5:27 p.m., emergency door alarm pulsed for 4 seconds, then cleared. 5:34 p.m., card 31 exited. There were no logs for Vanessa that second day, which fit the bait shop video that had placed her the night before. Good, Harper said. We can put them on the dock both days. From the office, they went to the technician's cupboard where the Marina kept replacement parts. Rosa asked Pete to show the bin for camera covers, and he did, cheeks red with worry. The bin was empty, and the inventory sheet showed none ordered for 6 months. Rosa photographed the empty bin and the sheet, then sealed the torn scrap of clear tape Oscar had found into an evidence bag with a new label and logged the time. Harper called crime scene techs to swab the stern rail for oils and trace. While they waited, Rosa crossed to the bait shop to have Luann sign a sworn statement authenticating the USB footage, then returned and placed the signed page on top of the log stack so the paper trail stayed clean. Next, they drove to the carrier store with a second warrant for Vanessa's and Brandon's phone location data for the 2 days. And by mid-afternoon, a tech in a side room pulled tower pings and gave them a simple printout under seal. Vanessa's phone hit a tower nearest the marina at 6:40 p.m. the night before, then traveled west along the causeway. Brandon's phone hit the same tower both nights, and on the day of the death, it mapped a straight line from company headquarters to the dock, a dwell near the slip, and then away. Rosa's mouth stayed a flat line, but her pen tapped once like a tiny gavel. Harper sent the location logs for plotting on a map overlay. On the way back to St. Petersburg, they stopped at a small insurance office where a records clerk, responding to the warrant, produced a folder with Daniel's policy. Basic coverage raised to a high amount 6 months earlier, beneficiary changed to V. Smith, and a note on the account marked priority approval, relationship verified. Followed by a list of 2 emails from Vanessa's personal address to the agent. Rosa photographed each page and asked the clerk to notarize a copy. While Harper handled that, Rosa texted Douglas a simple update, motive on paper, and Douglas replied with one word, understood. By late afternoon, they reached the sheriff's substation, where a lab tech had already compared the clear adhesive square from Mark's toolbox to the residue on the bilge camera housing. The polymers matched. The tech also lifted a faint smudge near the top screw that looked like the start of a print, not enough to run, but enough to show contact after the cover was placed. It paired with Mark's statement about a woman in pearls pressing her thumb on the rail to check his work, which Rosa underlined twice in her notebook. Harper then pulled up audio files from Daniel's phone carrier, because even deleted voicemails sometimes live on a server for a while, and the tech found a small thing with a large shadow. A partial voice memo sent to Daniel's number as a voicemail that recorded for 12 seconds at 4:59 p.m. the day of the accident. Tagged unsent in a glitch. The sound of a woman breathing, then practicing the line. He loved the water. It was an accident. Followed by a soft curse and a hang-up. It was not proof of a push, but it was proof of a mind already building the story before the body was pulled from the bay. Rosa closed her eyes for one beat and then wrote pre-planned statement with the time. Harper saved the file to evidence and asked the tech to preserve the server logs. Now the timeline was tight. The camera covered the night before by a contractor paid in cash, gate logs placing Vanessa and Brandon on site. On the day of the death, Daniel arrived with his usual card. Brandon arrived, an alarm blipped, and Daniel's phone showed a missed call from Vanessa and a deleted voicemail header. The policy had been raised months earlier. The family had motive to keep control and to silence a voice that had started asking for audits at the factory. Rosa and Harper looked at each other like 2 mechanics who knew which bolt would free the jam if they turned it carefully. They decided to visit the teen dockhand on duty the night of the camera cover. His name was Tyler. He still wore his marina shirt from school to shift, and he kept looking from Rosa's badge to Harper's and back, like a kid growing up in 10 minutes. At first, he said nothing beyond, "I hold gates, I clean bait buckets." But Rosa showed him a still frame of him in the corner of Luann's video, his cap crooked, and he sagged in place, then spoke fast and low. The woman in the white sweater had said she was Vanessa. She said the camera was bugged and should be covered for privacy. She had pressed a folded bill into his palm when he opened the gate with his clip-on pass. And he had put the bill in his locker and not spent it because it felt dirty. Rosa asked if he still had it. He did. He brought it out, and Rosa sealed it. The serial number might match other cash drawn that day if anyone at the bank remembered a particular stack. Small chance, but small chances sometimes win cases. They let Tyler go with a warning to tell the truth if asked again, and his shoulders dropped as if someone removed a backpack he had forgotten he was wearing. The sun went down while they finished the day's list, and Rosa swung by Oscar's bungalow before heading home because he had earned each update with his steadiness. She told him straight. We have gate logs, phone pings, the insurance hike, the contractor's written statement, the adhesive match, a partial print, and an audio file where she practices her line. We need one more strong piece, like a message between them or a video of the push. But the frame is built, and Oscar nodded, eyes wet but clear, and said, "Good wood." The way a carpenter praises a plank that will not split when a screw bites. He asked what would happen next, and Rosa said Harper would draft affidavits for arrest and search, likely for obstruction, evidence tampering, and insurance fraud first, while the state attorney weighed the homicide count. Douglas called during the brief meeting to say lenders had moved the company to cash on delivery with all suppliers, and that West Park Industries was prepared to take key assets if a forced sale came, with offers ready for the plant workers. Oscar thanked him and said he wanted a safety program in Daniel's name as a condition. When the call ended, the intercom buzzed at Oscar's gate. Vanessa's voice came through, tight and sharp. "You are ruining us. Open the gate." And Oscar pressed the talk button and answered in the same quiet tone he had used all his life. "No," then added, "If there is anything true you forgot to tell the sheriff, now is a good time." And Vanessa hissed a curse and drove off with too much gas. Rosa stood in the dark kitchen, listening to the Gulf breathe through the window screen, and said to Oscar, "Storms close." And he said, "Let it rain." And they both knew that in the morning, the case would move from quiet collection to loud consequence. And they were ready for the sound. The morning after Vanessa's late-night visit to Oscar's gate began with a white sunrise over the bay and a plan that did not bend. At 6:15 a.m., Detective Harper's team fanned out with signed warrants. One group to Vanessa's waterfront condo, another to Brandon's townhome, a third to the company garage where the white SUV lived when it was not under her. Rosa rode with Harper to the condo, her notebook ready, her face calm, and when Vanessa opened the door in a robe with her hair pinned up, the deputies showed the papers and stepped inside without raising their voices. They collected her phone from the nightstand, her tablet from the kitchen island, and a small home safe from the closet that she said held personal documents, which turned out to be a neat folder with life insurance letters, a list of passwords on a yellow sticky note, and a bank envelope with cash that matched the denomination Tyler had handed over the night before. A second team walked the garage and photographed the white SUV, front and back, and dusted the rear plate dent. They also collected a pearl-handled bottle of hand lotion from the door pocket, a detail Rosa noted because of the thumb press on the stern rail smudge. At the same hour, Brandon opened his front door to find deputies and a warrant that listed electronic devices, marina cards, maintenance notes. And he tried a joke that sat dead in the air, then stepped aside. The team took his phone, a work laptop stamped with the company logo, and a small tackle box in the hall closet with 2 screwdrivers and a strip of clear adhesive squares, like the one from Mark's kit. By 8 a.m., the teams converged at the substation, logged evidence, and handed devices to a digital analyst who began the steady work of scraping messages, photos, and location history, while Rosa and Harper sat in a small interview room and wrote a simple order of questions on a legal pad. Where were you the night before? Why was the camera covered? Why did your card open the gate? Why did you call Daniel at 5:11 p.m.? Why did you practice a line about an accident? And who raised his insurance? At 9:10 a.m., Vanessa entered cuffed, her lawyer trailing, and took the chair on the far side of the table. She kept her chin up, eyes hard, and said they were making a mistake. But Harper read the rights in a plain voice and set the bait shop still frame in front of her. Then the gate log with her card number. Then the insurance letter with her email on it. And then the audio printout of the 12-second voicemail unsent tag. When he asked the first question, she said nothing. When he asked the second, she said, "No comment." By the third, she was leaning forward and saying, "You do not know the pressure he put on us." And the lawyer touched her wrist, and she stopped. But the slip mattered because it showed motive like a light under a door. At 9:40 a.m., Brandon followed into a second room, less sure than his sister, and he said he had gone to the marina the night before to check a loose cleat, which the logs did not show. And on the day of the death, he only walked by the dock after a meeting, which the alarm and dwell time did not support. Harper asked him about the strip of clear adhesive in his closet, and Brandon shifted in his chair and said he kept supplies for household fixes. The analyst knocked and handed Harper a quick sheet. A message from Vanessa to Brandon the night before at 6:32 p.m., dock cam offline, followed by Brandon's reply at 6:43 p.m., covered, and a draft note in Vanessa's phone typed at 4:55 p.m. The day of the accident that matched the practiced line almost word for word. Harper slid the printout across the table. Brandon's eyes moved left and right. He asked for a lawyer. The interview stopped. The state attorney, already briefed, approved immediate charges for evidence tampering, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and obstruction, with the homicide count pending the medical review. Rosa then drove to the medical examiner with Harper to request a second look at Daniel's file, and a senior pathologist, careful and exact, pulled photos and measurements from the first autopsy and frowned at a faint pattern on Daniel's left forearm that had been logged as a dock bruise, but now, seen next to a photo of the stern rail, matched the rail's spacing too cleanly for a random fall. He also pointed out microabrasions on the right shoulder, consistent with a sudden shove against textured fiberglass. Nothing was graphic or certain yet, but it was enough to add weight to the push theory. Harper asked for a written addendum. The doctor agreed and started dictation while Rosa photographed the comparison. At noon, Douglas called Oscar from the company cafeteria, where employees were eating in worried silence, to say the lenders had moved to cash on delivery with all suppliers, and that James Morrison of West Park Industries was ready to meet in a neutral office downtown. Oscar ate a simple sandwich at his kitchen table, looked at Daniel's cap, and said he would be there at 1. He arrived early and shook James's hand, and James laid out a clear, respectful path. A fast asset purchase for the factory and inventory, offers to keep every skilled worker on equal or better terms, and a pledge to run audits and safety training from day one. Oscar listened, asked about health coverage and seniority, and then added a condition without drama. There is a fund in my son's name for marina safety and worker scholarships. It travels with the deal and grows with a small % of plant profit. And James nodded and said yes on the spot. They signed a short letter of intent prepared by Douglas, and Douglas handed a copy to the company attorney, who met them in the hall with eyes that looked tired but relieved. By 2, news of the arrests had reached the lobby in whispers and then in headlines on phones. And the press stood outside the substation when Harper walked Vanessa in orange to a van for transport to first appearance. Oscar did not go there. He went to the cemetery instead, bringing fresh marigolds because Clara always said they kept away the bad. And he sat on the bench and told the stone what had happened, about the gate logs, the voicemail, the lotion bottle, the second autopsy look, the deal to save the plant. And his voice stayed steady because he had promised Daniel he would do this slow and clean. At 4, Rosa texted him that the judge had set bond high for Vanessa and required surrender of passports, and that Brandon's hearing was set for the morning. She also said the lab had matched trace from the Pearl Lotion's base to the smudge on the rail, not a fingerprint but a chemical echo, and that the analyst had pulled one more useful thread, a search on Vanessa's tablet 2 weeks earlier for how to disable bilge camera and Marina Gate logs how long kept, both simple but loud in their intent. Oscar wrote intent in his notebook and underlined it once. At 6, he and Douglas met briefly with the CFO at the plant, a careful man who cared about the line crew more than the letterhead, and they agreed on a message for the morning. Payroll protected under an emergency bridge that James had arranged, operations to continue, management changes pending court outcomes, no one losing their job for a mistake at the top. The crew leaders nodded, some with tears, some with tight jaws. Oscar shook hands and thanked people by name when he knew them and by job when he did not. As the sun slid low, he drove home along the bay, less gray now, the water catching color from a clean sky, And when he reached the bungalow, he took off his blazer, set the cap on the table, and answered a call from a number he did not know. It was a worker from the night shift, voice rough, saying he had heard the news and wanted to say thank you, because the plant fed families. And Oscar said, "Keep your head down. Do your work. Safety first. Help the new crew if they ask." And the man laughed once and said he would. At 9, Rosa knocked with 2 Cuban sandwiches and sat at the small kitchen table with Oscar and said, "Tomorrow we finish the first part." And Oscar nodded and said, "Then we start the part that lasts." And he looked at the folder on the counter with West Park's letter and at the note on the fridge with the word truth written in Clara's old hand from years ago. And he felt the huddle like a frame that had finally squared, still old, still creaking, but true and ready to hold. 6 months later, the Florida heat came early, but the work moved in a straight line. And Oscar kept to his small routines while the case took its final shape. West Park Industries closed on the asset purchase in May. The new sign went up over the Tampa plant, and the crew leaders walked the floor with clipboards and quieter faces because payroll was safe and parts came in on time again. Rosa spent those weeks building clean edges on every piece of proof, meeting with the state attorney, lining up witnesses in an order that would make sense to a jury that did not know docs or bilge cameras, or how a family can turn a company into a weapon. The indictment named Vanessa on second-degree murder, evidence tampering, and insurance fraud, and named Brandon on conspiracy and tampering. Mark Ellison pled to a lesser charge for interfering with the camera and agreed to testify. Tyler the dockhand told the truth under oath, voice shaking, about opening the gate and the folded bill. The medical examiner filed an addendum that compared the bruise on Daniel's forearm to the stern rail's spacing and noted microabrasions on his right shoulder consistent with a sudden shove, not a clean slip. The lab wrote up the adhesive match, the lotion-based transfer on the rail, and the unsent voicemail where Vanessa practiced the line, "He loved the water. It was an accident." The digital analyst printed the messages that tied the plan to real time, Vanessa's doc cam offline, and Brandon's covered, and the search history for disable bilge camera and Marina Gate logs how long kept. Rosa kept the chain of custody logs crisp because she knew a bent staple can be enough for a defense to pry at. And Detective Harper stayed steady in his suit and spoke about sequence, not drama. Whenever a reporter tried to turn the case into a headline at the courthouse steps, Oscar did not give interviews. He watered the marigolds by the kitchen window, walked the pier in the evening, signed scholarship papers for the safety fund in Daniel's name, and met twice a month with James Morrison to read short updates about production targets and worker training. He always asked the same first question: "Any injuries this month?" And James always answered first on safety before he talked about profit. The trial began on a Monday in June, under a bright sky and cool air in a courtroom that smelled like paper and floor wax. The judge kept a calm bench and told the jurors to listen to the order of things. The state called the bait shop owner, Luann, who set the time on her camera and described the white SUV and the woman in the white sweater pacing before sunset. They called Pete from the marina to authenticate gate logs and to say the camera bin had been empty for months. They called the carrier tech to map the phones that moved like pins on a simple line from city to dock. They called Mark, who sat with folded hands and described the cash job to cover the bilge camera housing, the blue tape edges, and the pearl-eared woman who pressed her thumb near the top screw to check his work. They called Tyler, who stared at the jury box and told about the clip-on pass and the bill he never spent, and brought it in an evidence bag, like a boy returning a borrowed tool. They called the lab tech to talk about polymers and a lotion base that migrated in a tiny trace from a bottle in a car door pocket to a rail on a boat. They called the analyst who read the DocCam offline thread and showed the draft line typed minutes before the accident. They called the pathologist who laid the rail next to a photo of Daniel's forearm on a screen and explained patterns without heat. They played the 12 seconds of breath and practice, and the room went still in a way that was not theater, but simple human quiet. The defense called weather and chance and said the bay can take a man without malice, said a busy woman's searches prove nothing but curiosity, said a bad investment fight is not a motive for murder, and tried to cut the case into small, unconnected pieces. Rosa sat behind the bar, hands folded, and watched jurors' eyes track the lines on the screen as if they were reading a simple blueprint. Harper testified last, talking about order and time. What door opened when? What phone pinged where? What camera saw a sweater before sunset? And he never raised his voice. When the state rested, Vanessa surprised the room and asked to speak. Her lawyer advised against it, but she insisted, and she took the stand with perfect posture and said she was a wife under pressure who made bad choices to protect a company her husband loved. She said she covered a camera because of privacy, said she went to the dock to check a line, said she called him because she was worried, and when the prosecutor asked why she practiced an accident line before the rescue boats reached the pier, she said she had felt something and wanted to be ready. The jurors wrote notes with slow pens. The cross-examination was short. Did you raise his life insurance? Yes, we agreed it was prudent. Did you ask your brother to cover the dock camera? No. Did you text dock cam offline? I do not recall the exact words. Did your brother reply covered? I do not recall. The prosecutor held up the printout and let the letters sit in the air. The defense rested the next day without calling Brandon. Closing arguments stayed close to the ground. The state said a plan does not need fancy words. It only needs steps, and these steps were straight. The defense said grief bends memory and coincidence stacks in storms. The jury went out just before lunch on Wednesday and came back before the end of the day. They found Vanessa guilty on second-degree murder and evidence tampering, and guilty on the insurance fraud count. They found Brandon guilty on conspiracy and tampering. The judge set sentencing 2 weeks out and remanded both. Oscar sat in the second row with his hands on his cane and did not move when the clerk read the words. He only breathed out once and felt his chest grow lighter in a way that hurt. At sentencing, the judge spoke like a carpenter measuring twice, choosing a number that did not make a show but made a point. Years that would carry into the time when heat breaks and returns, with no chance to step on a dock for a very long while. And Vanessa looked straight ahead and blinked twice at a place on the wall where there was nothing. The judge asked if the family wished to speak. Oscar stood and took 2 steps to the microphone and said in a plain voice, "My son told the truth for a living. The truth is that he died in a way he did not choose. I asked the court to protect the people who worked for that company and to let the water be a place for life, not lies." And he walked back without looking at the defense table. After court, Oscar declined the reporters again, shook Harper's hand, hugged Rosa, and went home to water the marigolds. Summer pushed on. West Park kept the plant running, added a safety class with a plaque that read, "The Daniel Collins Fund," and promoted 2 line workers who had trained new hires during the hard weeks. Tyler finished high school and started a marine tech program paid by the scholarship. Mark kept his head down and did legal work only. Patricia sent 2 more messages that swung like a broken gate between apology and blame. Oscar did not answer. One evening, James asked Oscar to join the board. Oscar smiled and said no, then brought cookies to the night shift anyway, and told stories about measuring true when the power is out. On the last Friday of June, he drove to the pier at dusk with a small brass plate in his pocket and a screwdriver in his hand. He had asked the city for permission to place the plate on the bench where he and Clara used to sit, and the permit sat folded in his wallet next to a faded photo. He set the plate, Daniel's Place. Stay safe. Check your gear, tight against the wood, and turned the screws until they seated flush. Then he stood, leaned his weight on the new rail, and looked out at boats coming home with flags moving and coolers sloshing. A young father walked by with a small boy who asked about the plate, and the father read it out loud, slowly, and tipped his cap to the old man at the rail. Oscar tipped his cap back. The water breathed steady, the way it does when a storm has passed, but the air still remembers, and Oscar felt the house of his life square a little more. He did not think of revenge anymore. He thought of truth like a rail you can lean on without falling, and of work that keeps hands busy and minds clear. His phone buzzed once, a text from a number he did not know. "My job is safe. Thank you." And he put the phone away and watched the light slip down the bay until the markers blinked on like small, patient stars.